Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzy Ostwald. The Hebrew Bible says that God created humanity in God's image, but oftentimes human beings like to create God in their own image. By visualizing a God that looks like ourselves, we can better relate to God sometimes. Christians have visualized Jesus in many ways, some of those ways which are not very realistic. My guest today, Karina Richards, has contemplated and written about the many ways Christians have visualized and portrayed Jesus. Welcome, Karina.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. So, you've been one of my students in a couple of religious studies classes, and you are a major in literary studies. So, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to incorporate literary studies and religious studies as part of who you are here at Appalachian State.
So I am an RC 1000 professor for this semester, and next semester I'm teaching RC 2001. And in the religious studies program at App State, I originally had joined to try to get more knowledge about the Bible and Christianity because the Bible plays such an important role in literature. And I think in almost every single English class that I've had, even in high school, somehow the Bible was a part of our classes and a part of the curriculum. And so having that background and understanding of those stories has always been like really important in those classes. But once I joined the program, I realized how much I loved learning about religion and how much I loved learning about religions other than Christianity.
I really like your note that the Bible has played such an important role in the history of Western literature.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad you sought us out for that reason. Do you see in your study of literature other areas of intersection or overlap between religion and the literature that you study?
Yeah, I think for my thesis, for my master's program, I'm doing research on indigenous literature, and a lot of the Christian influence there is in the colonization of Christians on indigenous nations, which is also really important to learn about, and it's a little bit harder to come to terms with, but
right.
Yeah.
Do you study indigenous literature itself, the folk tales or the myths and the fables that are part of indigenous culture?
The only time that I studied those was in your class, Religion in America. But for my thesis, I'm doing more of contemporary lit for indigenous lit. Yeah.
So you're in the MA program here now, and you're, I know, preparing to go on to PhD programs in literary studies.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think you'll continue to investigate this intersection between religion and literature that I find so fascinating?
Yeah, I was hoping to get more information about PhD programs that maybe have like an MA in religion alongside the PhD, or a PhD in both religion and literature at the same time. But there are fewer programs like that. I think only Emory has that option.
Maybe Chicago.
Yeah. But I think that I would like to continue learning more about religion because I think that in almost every class there's an allusion that you learn about to the Bible.
Yeah.
In a lot of American and British lit.
Yeah. So you already said that you studied religion to learn more about biblical literature, but you were surprised to find out how much you enjoyed studying religion. Is there anything about the religious studies program at ASU beyond that surprised you or that created particular challenges?
Yeah, I think my classes with Dr. Reed were really surprising in discussing like the impact of religion on the government and like capitalism and Marxism, things like that. But also the discussion of like AI and religion in conjunction is really interesting.
Yeah, he does a lot with artificial intelligence. We're going to talk about that a little bit later today too.
Yeah.
So some of the work you've done for me and in your other classes has to do with images. and the role that images play in religion. Tell me a little bit about how you got interested in religious images in particular, or the way that religion uses images to, I guess, promote faith or better understand faith.
I think when I was taking Religion in America with you like a year ago now, I think that we had a class discussion maybe one day about how Jesus is portrayed, and I think that I never thought of Jesus as any gender other than male before, and I think that that really was surprising to like just to think about even, and then to see the images of Jesus portrayed as a woman were also really interesting because it made me challenge like what I had grown up seeing like while growing up in the church and going to people's houses and things like that.
Yeah, we're going to look at some images of Jesus here in a minute, but as we were chatting beforehand, you mentioned another image that you had seen in a couple of different contexts, and this is a sculpture by Bernini of the, I think it's called the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, and we're going to look at that up here. And just tell me what this brings to mind for you when you look at this statue, this sculpture of Saint Teresa, and then we can talk about the role that images can play.
This image is really interesting to me because of the interaction that Saint Teresa claimed to have with an angel, was it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that a lot of literature, especially from the Renaissance, talks about like the interactions that people had with God or Christ or an angel or some other divine being. But they never, I don't think that art as commonly is discussed in that context. So having this image like in contrast to like a poem or a sonnet, where there's this interaction with the divine being is very interesting to.
Yeah, so your literary background and your focus on literary, this is a completely different way of communicating the way human beings have interactions with God. And it's very powerful, right?
Yes.
The visual presentation.
Yeah. And I think that too, especially in the time that this was created, this interaction probably would have been deemed very inappropriate. And a lot of people would have very strong opinions about it.
Some people say it has erotic overtones.
Yeah.
And Saint Teresa was a nun, so that raises the controversy level even further, and a saint, of course. But you talk about how visualizing religious subjects helps us to better relate to, in this case, experiences, I guess. But then when you move on to visualizing God, all right, and portraying God, how does that help a religion to communicate something about a particular portrayal of God?
I think that a lot of times that has to do with like earthly like wants and desires. Like the people in power want to use that image to benefit themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so likely the people who are creating these images are making them look like themselves. And so it ends up being like really problematic.
So you can use an image of a saint or a god or a divine being to promote a certain belief structure, and
Yes.
it may not be true to the person or the entity that is being imaged in that case.
Yeah, one of the scholars that I was reading, they had some sort of study that was about how like people who are in power on earth or like are viewed as leaders or like bosses are based on like this image that we've created of God and Jesus. So the image of Jesus or God as a white man makes people view white men as the leaders or people in power.
So it empowers a certain group of people.
Yeah. So
So-
it's been used to like create that power and also to empower people. Yeah.
So it portraying Jesus as a white male reinforces the notions of white power structures in society. All right, so I want to come back to that in a moment as we look at some of these images, but sometimes imaging God can create controversies too. There's a whole historical controversy about the use of icons in worship, and icons are religious images that are used in ritualistic activities. And some people are afraid that the use of art, particularly depicting a god or religious figure, can lead to idolatry. Is that something that you've searched for in your work, or is that something that has come up as a kind of controversial use of images?
Yeah, I think that oftentimes what ends up happening with that conversation is it's overpowered by people in power who want to continue spreading those images, because I think that even though there is a small section of the population who believes that there shouldn't be images of divine beings, such as the ones that have been created, they end up being overshadowed by the people in power who have created the images.
Okay. Well, let's look at some of these images. Your research in particular focused on depictions of Jesus in American culture. Okay, and one of the things about depicting Jesus is we don't have any, or very few, particularly not in canonical literature, descriptions of what Jesus looked like. Right? Now we know something about. We think we know something about Jesus' ethnicity and background, but we don't have a description of Jesus. So we get all these different images that are supposed to reflect who and what Jesus was. You did a survey, I think, mm-hmm. right? And tell us a little bit about what your survey indicated about the way the typical American might view Jesus.
I had originally started the paper by only wanting to look at how people believe Jesus acted. So one of the main parts of the survey was figuring out like if people thought Jesus was kind or like violent. And there was many of the adjectives I included for them to select had that sort of like binary, like was he a good or was he a bad person, really? But then near the end of the survey, I included a bit where they could describe how they viewed Jesus. And most people ended up just clicking the answers, but I had a few people type in answers. And a lot of the people, I think the majority of people thought of Jesus as a white man with brown hair and brown eyes. And I think I only had like a handful of people say that they thought of Jesus as a woman or as a black person.
Okay. Did you separate those responses by gender and ethnicity at all, or do you know whether women were more apt to see Jesus as a woman, or a person of color might be more apt to see Jesus as a person of color?
Yeah, I didn't actually look at like the people who responded versus their response because I wanted to keep the survey as anonymous as possible. Okay. But I think that the majority of my responders were, I think that the majority were white, but I'm not sure. And a lot of them, the age range was from like 11 to 75.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's look at some of these images and when comment on them. This is perhaps the most. This is anecdotal, of course, but I think this is probably the most well-known portrait of Jesus in contemporary America. You want to say something about this, or this is the one that you probably grew up with in your church, the one I grew up with in my church?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting to me to think about like the fact that a lot of people don't question this image. And like I didn't ever question it either. And it's weird to think that Jesus has been widely portrayed just in this way, and that this is the first image that pops in people's heads when they think of Jesus.
Yeah, and from what we know about Jesus, it's very, very unlikely that this is an accurate portrayal. Obviously, we have a kind of Caucasian man here with light brown hair, and maybe he's got blue eyes in this picture. I'm not sure. I think it was brown in the original. Mm-hmm. But Jesus would have been a man of Middle Eastern descent, so he would not have looked like this. But this is a particular portrayal, as you mentioned earlier, of Jesus as a white male, and that tends to support power structures in our culture, and it tends to reflect really the way we see ourselves, I guess, or the way we're taught to see ourselves. This image often reflects what people want to see in their God, and they want to see themselves reflected in their God. It sort of reinforces certain power structures in society.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that so many children are used to this image ends up influencing their interactions with other people later on.
Yeah. Well, the next image I've got is kind of I think, a very interesting take on this well-known image, and of course it's the same pose, and the facial structures are very similar, but of course here you have Jesus depicted as a man of color. Now, do you think that this is a purposeful attempt to allow people of color to better relate to the figure of Jesus, or how do you think this is a kind of revision of the original that we saw?
I would hope that it was made more so to reflect what might have been historically accurate as to what Jesus looked like. And I also think that these, spreading an image like this rather than the first image makes even white people realize that Jesus, it makes people question what they've heard growing up, which I think is always important to do instead of just believing everything as it seems.
Yeah. So I visit a predominantly African American church occasionally, and there are two depictions of Jesus in that church. One is the one that we looked at first, which is common, and the other right beside it is the picture of Jesus as a person of color. And I think it's meant to do exactly what you say, represent Jesus as a person who shouldn't be necessarily tied to one ethnicity or racial group. So I think I have another image here of Jesus as a person of color, as a black Jesus with a crown of thorns. So again, here's a depiction of Jesus from an entirely different perspective, different ethnic perspective. Now, you mentioned part of what's going on here maybe is an attempt to break an image of Jesus away from a particular ethnic group, but also is an effort to portray Jesus in a more historically accurate way. All right, so let's see this next image. This is obviously a generated image. I think it's an AI generated image of what Jesus might have looked like based upon his ethnicity as a Middle Eastern Jew and based on the culture of his time period. So you want to comment on this and perhaps the next one, which is also an AI attempt to portray Jesus with Middle Eastern characteristics.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that when you search Jesus or God in Google, the first thing that comes up is a white man. So the fact that these are AI created is just interesting to me because it seems like also with AI you would have to specifically type in Jesus accurately portrayed, because I think that if you just typed in Jesus or God, it would probably give you the same depiction of a white man. How did you find?
I had to go searching for them because,
Yeah.
like you, when I was looking for images and typed in, I think, images of Jesus, virtually everything was not necessarily that first image we looked at, but virtually everything was some kind of depiction of Jesus as a Caucasian male. So to get other images, I had to do a little more sophisticated search. Yeah. And I guess what that tells us is the saturation of the depiction in our culture of the depiction of Jesus as a Caucasian male. Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea what the reaction would be in kind of mainstream Protestant white church if this image of Jesus replaced the images that we're more accustomed to?
I think that there would definitely be some outrage. I think that there's still people who push back on like the idea of the Bible like being written by humans and created by humans. And so I think that this idea of like this being who is so divine, like even though Jesus like is a historical person, I think that people still fight back against the idea of like Jesus as a human being.
Right, and this does humanize him in place and time,
Yeah.
right? So let's go to the next image here. All right, here's one that might even be more controversial, right? So I went looking for images that focused on Jesus portrayed with feminine characteristics. And a lot of them portrayed Jesus, but not as, I guess, as masculine as some of the images we've looked at. But this one actually portrays Jesus as a woman. It's an AI-generated piece of art, and it forces us to think about Jesus in another way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe forces us to think about some of the feminine characteristics of Jesus. You want to comment on that, because I think you said some of the respondents to your survey admitted to thinking about Jesus from a feminine perspective.
Yeah, I think a lot of my participants too like thought of God maybe as a woman, and I think that there's also there might even be more pushback against that than the other images, because of the idea of like masculine traits and like men being the power dominant people in the culture. I think that a lot of people push back against this image because they don't think that a woman can be in that position of power and like, be able to hold it.
Do you think this image helps women better relate to the figure of Jesus or to God, or still going to be that kind of cultural bias towards thinking of a divinity as a male?
I think it probably depends, because I think that more Orthodox Christians, more like traditionally leaning Christians would definitely be angered by this image rather than empowered by it. I think that there would be more hate toward it. But I also think that I grew up in a more progressive church, and the women there always referred to God with like they, them pronouns, or even alternated between he and she. Because I think a lot more progressive leaning Christians think of God as more of a divine being instead of inhabiting like these gendered aspects.
Well, now, I've seen the Sistine Chapel. God's an old guy with white hair and a white beard, right? That's the way it's traditionally. So the fact that you've grown up in a congregation that tends to move out of those kinds of pigeonholes that we try to put images of God in is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've got one final image, and I had to use it to contrast it with this feminine image, and this is just a kind of hyper masculine AI-generated image of Jesus as warrior, boxer with the hyper-masculine characteristics. Now, this is one way we like to think about Jesus, right?
Yeah, like as a warrior, as someone who will protect you.
This is the Jesus who will come back at the end of time to take the world back, right?
Yeah.
So in all of these images, there's something being reflected. Either Jesus is the power broker, Jesus is the caring feminine spirit, Jesus as the person of color reaching out to all people, and so forth. Now, beyond the physical, I don't know if I can look at that anymore. We need to go back to our Religion and Life logo. Beyond these physical depictions of Jesus, we've got a lot, and this is where your literary background comes from, a lot of literary depictions of Jesus. What do you, in your survey, what were the predominant characteristics of Jesus expressed that come out of the literature? And I guess the literature that most people would be familiar with would be the New Testament Gospels.
Yeah. So do you mean like the adjectives that people...
Yeah, like Jesus as loving, as Savior.
Yeah, I think the majority of my responses were like positive ways of thinking about Jesus, but I also had, I think, over 20 people out of my almost 250 responders say that they thought of Jesus and God as bloodthirsty and like vengeful, things like that were like very violent terms that like I myself had never considered in terms of like Jesus and God. So those were very shocking.
Yeah, maybe that last image. Yeah, the idea of Jesus is vengeful and bloodthirsty. Did people use the metaphor of a lamb to describe the gentle Jesus?
Yeah. I think it's interesting there though to use like an animalistic term
right.
for Jesus when Jesus is supposed to be like this divine, otherworldly being.
Yeah. So the predominant picture that we normally think of coming out of the literature is a Jesus who is forgiving, kind, gentle, gathers the children to him, and very nurturing. And those are kind of feminine characteristics when we think not necessarily about images, but about personality traits and characteristics. And that seems to be the predominant. But you found another Jesus in your literary studies, and this is what I love about where literature has taken you, in the infancy gospel of Thomas, that is not in the Bible, but it was a gospel written at about the same time. Just in the little bit of time we have left, maybe mention a little bit about the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah. So for my research, I really wanted to look at non-canonical texts to be able to get a more like full, well-rounded like depiction of Jesus. And so the infancy gospel of Thomas, I came across it and I really just thought of it as funny at first. But then it became very interesting when it was compared to like texts that are actually in the Bible, because it portrays Jesus as a child who's really a menace to society, and he kills two of his friends and he ends up bringing them back to life, but everyone in his town is like terrified of him, and the parents of the children ask Mary and Joseph to literally remove him from their town and live somewhere else. It's really interesting to think about Jesus not only as a kid but also as like this sort of little menace that's just running around.
A brat.
Yeah.
Well, Karina, this has been fascinating. I really am proud of you and look forward to watching you progress through your PhD studies and maybe someday coming back to teach at Appalachian.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed our talk about images of God, and I hope you'll join us again next week on App TV. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.